Welcome to Praxis. I'm Olivia Rousset. I'd like to welcome our audience here in Sydney, as well as those on APAC, online or listening on radio, and a special welcome to our live audience in Timor-Leste. On our panel today, we have Archie Law, who is the CEO of ActionAid Australia, Nick Austin, the CEO of the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, or ACIAR, and Denis Blight, the Executive Director of the Crawford Fund. Today we're discussing food security and the global food crisis. Having food security means that all members of a household have continuing access to nutritious and safe food. It's estimated that 1 billion people worldwide are hungry all the time. 200 million, or one-third of these malnourished people, live in sub-Saharan Africa. In the past 3 years, 200 million more people have been pushed into hunger. In 2008, price spikes in domestic food staples had a devastating impact on the world's poor. And experts have warned that such price volatility and food shortages will only get worse in years to come. 3/4 of the world's poor live in rural areas and make their living from agriculture. Hunger and child malnutrition are greater in these areas than in urban areas. The poorest landless and female-headed households are the hardest hit. Studies have shown that agriculture-led growth in most countries is more than twice as effective in reducing poverty as industry-led growth. Agricultural support for hunger reduction will be our panellists' focus today. Throughout this talk, I'll invite questions from the audience as well. So I'd like to throw it open to the panellists and just ask, what is food security?
Maybe I could paint a little bit of a picture of what food security actually isn't at the moment, and what's the face of food insecurity and lack of a right to food. I suppose for ActionAid, that face is a woman's face, and it's an African woman's face. It's someone who's struggling to get by day to day, has access to a small plot of land, possibly as little as a hectare, but doesn't own that land. Worth noting, African women producing 70% of the region's food, but owning 1% of the land. Doesn't have access to agricultural extension services, training. Doesn't have access to credit, limited access to inputs such as seed, fertiliser, pesticides, doesn't have adequate tools, basic tools like hose, and is dealing with a multiplicity of issues that come out of being food insecure or denied the right to food, and issues such as education. How do you keep kids in school when there's not enough food on the family table? Issues such as maternal child health. I mean, a kid that's born into a food insecure household in Africa, the chances of that child being stunted from an early age, and then the disadvantage that places on that child to be able to develop to the full potential that it has, in a sense really often stem from the fact that right to food's denied. And contrasting that with the situation in Australia when a child's born in Australia, I think it's worth parking that there as well.
Could follow on from that, and I think it's seems a little incongruous that half the world's hungriest people are farmers themselves. So what we have is that smallholder farmers are those that are most exposed to food insecurity. In addition to that 50%, there's another 20% who depend on the natural resource base for their income, and potentially another 20% on top of that who are landless farmers. So between 50 and 80% of the world's poor depend directly or indirectly immediately on agriculture and for their income, and they're also the hungriest people. So it seems somewhat incongruous. In your introductory comments, you made the connection or reference to both food prices and food security, and obviously price volatility is a more acute consequence, as we saw in 2008 with spikes in food prices. The rural poor are particularly vulnerable because of the high percentage of their income that is spent on food, typically sort of 50 to 80%. And if we contrast that to average OECD countries at around 15%, much more vulnerable to food price spikes. And as you said in your comments, we're more likely to see those fluctuations, but generally higher prices into the future. So volatility is going to be part of the characteristic, at least for the next decade.
Denis, what broader issues feed into?
Well, something you said, Olivia, in your introduction resonated with me, and that is hungry all the time. And in trying to build Australian community support for international development assistance and for international agricultural research, try to convey that sense of being hungry all the time. All of us are hungry from time to time. I was hungry here before I had a nice sandwich. But just imagine what it's like being hungry all the time, 24 hours a day, hungry. That's what we're up against. But also, that's a sense of what we're trying to convey, that we must do something about this. And Australia is well positioned to do something about it.
All right, I'll start to get into this a bit more with Archie. Archie is with ActionAid Australia, which is a rights-based organisation working across 45 countries, mainly in Africa. Going back to the women farmers, what can be done to alleviate their situation?
A lot is being done at the moment to alleviate women's problems specifically, and more generally the situation with farmers. I think it's a key message. I think it's been pointed out that this situation can be fixed, and really it's occurred through neglect. Much of it comes from neglect that's come across from an agenda that's been based on privatisation, deregulation and liberalisation, essentially the rollback of the state. And that's, in our view, that's what's got us to where we are now. The state has disengaged from agriculture, donors have pulled back from agriculture and rural development in general, and now we're faced with the results of that. But there are some really good examples where things are going forward, like Malawi, for example, where they've increased their share of the budget that's allocated from agriculture from 7% to 14% in 2005. They've gone from a food deficit of 43% to a food surplus of 57% as a result of that activity, and seen the average annual income rise to $240 from where it was $157. So in terms of the percentage of money that has to go on food versus money that can be allocated for other purposes, that can happen in a country like Malawi. But the issue will always be inequality, particularly inequality for women. From our perspective, it's actually incredibly important that women are organised and are able to engage with duty bearers such as the state and to have a conversation about what their needs and their vulnerabilities are. Every country where ActionAid is working, there are social movements, there are local organisations, and how do we strengthen those organisations? How do we link those organisations? And how do you create that conversation between those groups and a state? And of course in that also comes the whole mechanism of how do you build a stronger state than a state that most African countries in particular are living with at the moment. But I think that's, say, in the context of Australia. This is long haul too, in terms of the next 20 years or so, but the gains that the women's rights movement and the feminist movements made in Australia has been because women organised, they knew what they wanted and they made some noise and they talked to government. And that will change according to context, of course. We're not encouraging people living in countries such as Burma to get out on the street and make some noise, because we know what sort of noise that's usually accompanied by, and it's the noise of a gunshot. But it's important that it's contextual and that women are organised.
But there's in a lot of African countries that women can't be landowners. There's a lot of huge and fundamental inequalities that need to be overcome first. Yeah. How can that, do donor governments need to do more in putting pressure on those governments, or how can those things be changed?
The change has to come from within. Mm-hmm. I think we've seen with a number of countries, such as India, for example, where the right to food is actually legislated in India. It's the law. And that's come across because of civil society, a very active and robust civil society engaging with the government to actually sign that right into law. We've seen a very rights-based constitution in South Africa coming out of apartheid, where people's human rights are actually legislated. And I think that's the first step is how do you get that right to food actually legislated for by governments. And there's a role from donor governments to persuade, cajole their colleagues. I personally take issue as far as what's more important, the state sovereignty or people's human rights. I think that's something to park out there. But I think the more the more pressure that is on a state to actually legislate, and then it's a matter of working through both civil society, but also bodies such as the UN, in the back rooms, donor governments, on how do you operationalise that. And that's where we're seeing big gains in countries like India, because it's been recognised as a human right, and then it's a matter of holding a government to account for actually delivering.
But the biggest gains in India came as a consequence of agricultural research and increased food production. It's one thing, and I don't dispute at all the question you say about establishing a law, but to deliver on that law you need to increase food production. And India is a success story, from 7 million tonnes in 1948 to something like 17 million tonnes in 1968 to 70 million tonnes at the end of the 20th century. So a tenfold increase in 50 years. Now that wasn't because of any law, LAW or otherwise, it was because of enhanced investment in agriculture, which was a government function, the benefits of international agricultural research, and in particular the Green Revolution. So you've got to have both. You've got to actually have the science, the law and the science, if you like, that delivers on the Millennium Development Goals, for example. We can set those goals, but we won't achieve them unless we invest in agriculture and in international agricultural research in particular.
The lessons from India do tell us too that it's important to have growth, but we need sustainable growth. And that's been one of the main challenges in India, actually. I think it's okay to have huge gains in productivity, but it needs to be sustainable. It needs not to damage soils, not to damage the ecosystem or human and social capital. And I think they're the lessons we're learning from India as well.
And it needs to get to the people who need it. Can you talk a little bit more about how firstly, why women are the main farmers is somewhere like countries like in Africa, and what is preventing the access, the extension services, things like that, from actually getting to them?
Yeah. It's structural apartheid, if you like. That's how it's always been in male-dominated societies, and that's how men exercise power over women. That's at the core of the issue. It's about power relationships between men and women, which this country is still dealing with. Just to put it into the Australian context, I mean, it's interesting, even though all the advances that are made in a country like Australia, why do we have such high domestic violence rates in Australia? It's not about money, it's about power. How do you empower women to enable them to actually address that situation through organising? But that's how that's how women find themselves in that situation today in many countries in Africa. And it does go back to the previous comments. The way out is the organisation, the laws, the operationalising the laws as far as equality. But there's also issues in there too that can help, things like social protection. How can we ensure that women or girls in particular have access to school? How, and it comes back to the food issue, how are girls actually receiving a square meal at school to keep them in school? And that's something where NGOs can play a part. We have projects in Bangladesh, a pilot project where we're actually providing one meal a day for students in those schools. The idea being that ActionAid doesn't do what a government's meant to do, but we bring government representatives in, show them how this school operates and show the gains that it's making for women and for girls, and then encourage them to replicate that sort of approach. So I think we can sort of start with girls at that level. I think also with schools, how do we ensure that once girls become teenagers, in particular, that there's access to latrines and toilets that are separated by gender. A lot of the reason girls are dropping out of schools is because once they reach puberty, there's no separate toilets. So get the girls out of school, get them onto the farms. I think it's structural inequality is what we're dealing with in that particular situation.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to go to Nick Austin. Nick heads the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. ACIAR is a part of the Australian Government's program to promote sustainable development and poverty reduction. Nick, can you tell me what the ACIAR model is?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. ACIAR's model is somewhat unique, I think, around the world in that while we're part of the Australian aid program, we've got a mandate specifically for agricultural research, and obviously the link to food security is a key one there. What ACIAR does is broker partnerships effectively. We don't undertake research ourselves, but we work with Australian research institutions around the world, particularly developing country partners. So our priorities are set in large part by our partner countries, developing country partners, and we look to where Australia has capacity, particularly to respond to challenges to agricultural production.
Can you give a couple of examples at either extreme?
Yes, of course. Either extreme of...
You mentioned India earlier.
Yeah, okay. The way we approach it is really country specific, and I think that's an important point to make, where the capacity of the partner country's research institution plays a big part in the way in which we intervene or engage. So, for example, if we're working in the Pacific, which compared to a number of the countries we work in, may have lower national agricultural research capacity and extension capacity than perhaps in emerging economies like India and China. So our approach varies accordingly. Our investments in India, for example, much more about, it's a partnership of equals with researchers. So Australia benefits from accessing some of the research capabilities, biotechnology and otherwise in India. Our partnerships are focused on the more fundamental research, whereas perhaps in the Pacific, more applied end, looking at where we might connect higher value production systems to markets and those sort of investments. So we're driven by research questions, looking for how we can actually improve productivity and particularly smallholder incomes, which is intimately linked with food security, of course. Now, Archie, in his comments, I think, led with the word neglect, and there's been a neglect of agriculture and in that context, agricultural research over the past several decades. Now, this is worldwide, and I think if there's a real positive emerging from the food price crisis of 2008, has been a renewed engagement or interest in agriculture and in agricultural research. So we see, and we hear the term a crisis being a terrible thing to waste, and I don't think it has been wasted, and Australia certainly responded to that. In the budget of 2009, there was a $500 million almost additional funding allocated to food security, and a large part of that relates to, or a significant part of that relates to research and to supporting productivity. Aid programs worldwide, agriculture was around about 20% several decades ago. Proportion of aid to agriculture declined to about 3%. We've seen that turn around, and I think that's really positive. We're starting to see both donors and developing country governments investing more in agriculture and in agricultural research.
Denis mentioned the Green Revolution earlier in the 60s. Yeah. Is that what we need now, do you think?
In many ways, they were the low-hanging fruit, to use a relevant term. The Green Revolution got significant gains through variety improvement and through increasing inputs. New land, new water, new fertiliser inputs. What we don't have is access to a lot of those things. Land is constrained in many situations. Water availability is at best in many cases decreasing. We're seeing land degradation, erosion, salinity. So what we need in the next green revolution is not more of the same, but something that's far more smart, takes a far more holistic approach, systems approach, and is far more specific to the context, and so that a solution in PNG, for example, may look quite different to a solution in Vietnam. I recently travelled to Vietnam, the Mekong Delta, and saw firsthand overlaying the effects of climate change, effect of water extraction. I was there in April, and the rains normally for sowing rice hadn't come. And you can see the farms that we visited, typically about a hectare in size, the only source of income. So they've sold off the chickens or consumed the chickens they had. They're looking at off-farm sources of income to sustain the family till they can get some rains. So our investment there is looking at how water management, how different varieties can tolerate periods of drought, periods of inundation with flooding, and greater salinity because of the seawater intrusion near the delta of the Mekong. So each response is going to be situation specific, and that requires a far greater level of understanding driven by the respective countries' priorities and then partnering capacity to try and solve those problems. It won't be a one-size-fits-all that can be rolled out for big gains.
You've talked about sort of increased investment in agricultural research, but what about time? What?
That's that's an interesting dimension of this because the characteristic of agricultural research is the long lag times. In many cases, many decades. And I was talking on rice before, so I'll continue. If we're looking for a trait, perhaps, where rice can stand inundation, so it can be flooded, identifying varieties that have that particular characteristic, selecting that, crossing that into varieties that are available and locally suitable, takes 4 to 5 years at best. Increasing those seed stocks into sufficient volume that can be distributed might take another 4 or 5 years, and then working with the country systems to actually distribute those seeds, maybe 4 or 5 again. So in that simple example, it's minimum of 15 years until we can go from identifying the problem, finding a solution and actually getting adoption of varieties and getting farmers access to these varieties to improve their livelihoods. That multi-decadal sort of effect is really challenging in a situation where we've seen decreases and now, thankfully, reinvestment in agriculture, but there is a lag time from that disinvestment. If I take a couple more moments and just talk about the international scene and the developed country investment in agricultural research, which has been the source of much of the innovation in the developing world, there's been disinvestment in the developed world as well. So we won't have access to the spillovers, the technologies that have been developed elsewhere to the extent that has been the case in the past. And we're already seeing rates of productivity growth in agriculture around the world plateauing or in some cases declining, and that's particularly worrying, given, as I said, it takes some decades until things can be turned north again. So I think some real challenges in amongst all of that.
Denis Blight is from the Crawford Fund, which is a non-governmental organisation which advocates agricultural research to help the poor. Denis, do you think we can feed the poor without depleting the planet?
By definition, we have to. Malthus said we couldn't. Malthus said you can't grow 2 grains of wheat where once you could only grow 1. He was wrong. Ehrlich was wrong in the 50s. Ehrlich told us in the 50s to stop sending food aid to India because that's the only way they would learn to control their population. They were both wrong. But there are no quick fixes. There are no silver bullets. It takes time and patience. And it's actually quite hard to sustain public support for something which takes 10, 20, 30 years. This is a long haul. We're looking at 2050, by which time we have to double food production just to meet expected growth and demand. Double food production just to meet expected growth and demand. So that will take investment, time, patience, change, and how are we going to sustain public support for that long, hard slog when we see on our television screens hunger and poverty everywhere? And that's one of the things that the Crawford Fund is trying to do by using the sorts of examples which Archie and Nick have given us to say, actually, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. We can see food production in India increase tenfold, increase 50-fold over a period of years. But it's over a period of years. It's over a period of years. It'll take a long time. And the solutions ain't easy. You've got to build human capacity. That takes time. It takes 10 years, 15 years to train an agricultural scientist. You've got to enhance the education of women, which is probably one of the key things you can do, as Archie said, young girls and women, in a whole range of things, not agriculture necessarily, but in reproductive health and so on. you've got to give those women the tool of education to change things. It'll take time. How do we sustain public support over that long period of time? How do we persuade bipartisan support for an increase in the Australian aid program to 0.5% by 2015 and eventually to 0.7% of GDP? A pathetically small target, by the way. How do we build on the known generosity of Australians, the known generosities of Australians, and incorporate that both into private giving and public funding for aid programs?
Do you see a role for the private sector in establishing food security?
Yeah, definitely. And one of the great frustrations is the great success of private investment in agricultural research. People are making huge profits from investment in agricultural research. And I don't blame for that. Profit is a good word in my dictionary. But how do we, mainly on wheat, maize, cotton, crops grown in the West, how can we get the power of the private sector directed at the mung bean, directed at the cowpea, which is an important crop in West Africa, or at millet? How do you
do that?
Well, are there public sector interventions, I think is a way of putting that question. Is there a public policy intervention that you can find to help encourage that? For example, the reason that the multinationals don't invest in the cowpea is that there's no profit in it. There's no profit in it. So they won't take... It takes a long while for them to produce a more successful cowpea. It takes them 10, 15 years of investment to produce a more productive cowpea. There are models. And one approach would be to form consortia of governments, aid agencies, NGOs, to say, if you can produce a cowpea, which will grow under these conditions, no fertiliser, no more water, no pesticide, and we will undertake to buy X billion dollars worth of that product. And that might incentivate the private sector to say, OK, there's a market there for us, we'll invest in that product and see what happens. Now, there's some trials going on in this area in the health sector with the development of a pneumococcal disease, for a vaccine for pneumococcal diseases in children. And that sort of model is being piloted there. And I don't see why we can't say, well, OK, let's look at the cowpea, or let's look at millet. Can you invest in a drought tolerant? And can we pitch that to the Australian public as well? Can we say to the Australian public, look, you can feed that child, or you can feed that household. If we invest in international agricultural research, we can feed the whole village. And so can we mobilise that support from the private sector by working within the market, within things that incentivate them? Can we work with things that appeal to people like you and me?
How important is biodiversity? This is more for all of you, in both in research and in sustainable agriculture as well.
I mean, that was the question. I think Archie touched upon it. Can we feed ourselves and not deplete the earth of its biodiversity? I mean, biodiversity is absolutely essential to food production. We've got a disease, is it called UG99, a fungus, floating on the air towards Australia, which will devastate our wheat production unless we prepare for it. One of the ways of preparing for it is to draw on the existing biodiversity in wheat, to look for rare and unused strains of wheat which may or may not have resistance to that fungus, and to breed on that. So that, in a very practical way, is important. But also, we need biodiversity to enable the planet to breathe, as the director of Kew Gardens has put it to Stephen Hopper, allowing the planet to breathe. We need biodiversity to do that.
We need also to be able to access, taking Denis's point a little further in relation to the challenges we face with climate change and the variability that we can anticipate. We need to be able to access genetics that allow us to respond to that, and the world's genetic resources, particularly developing country resources, are going to be critical in that. So the way in which we manage those resources to be able to respond, whether it's plants or animals, to build in resilience into our crop systems, into our animal production systems, so that where there are new diseases, that we're able to respond. So with climate change, we can expect diseases in new places and new diseases in the same in places. So how do we actually manage the world's genetic resources in a way that allows the production systems to capture the benefits of the traits and the variability that exist to respond to particularly climate change, but many of the other challenges facing agriculture.
And the key in all of that is sustainability and really looking after the planet's ecosystem. It's as simple as that. And I think smallholder farmers are best placed to say actually what's worked for them and what will continue to work for them while encouraging new techniques, but let the farmer be the one that makes the decision on what works best for her. Let's not let that be a private sector or the price of seed be the determinant. Let's let that be the decision of the farmer. I think touching a little bit too on the issue of the role of the private sector. I mean, I agree with Denis. I think profit's a good word, but I think justice is a better one. I think there is an element, a role that the private sector may play, but at the same time, the private sector isn't going to cater for agricultural extension services for a farmer who's living in a very remote area. And I think that's where the role of government actually comes into play. And it's quite amazing what's going on in some African countries at the moment. I think the good news isn't really coming out. The governments that have committed to 10% of their budgets in agriculture are actually making huge gains. You look at countries like Ethiopia. I mean, Ethiopia, the amount of food insecure people has dropped from 63% to 46% over the last few years as a result of their radical increase in the amount of money they're giving to agriculture. And actually it needs the international community to step up. I mean, Australia's made a contribution, a generous contribution. Is that Australia's fair share? Well, no, maybe not. I think you look at how things are being counted as agricultural spend at the moment as well, where avian flu is all of a sudden being counted as assistance to agriculture. I mean, in the furthest fetched example, I think Germany is actually saying that boats that are being used to patrol the borders in a country like Nicaragua that they're providing is assistance to agriculture. I think there's a role here to make sure that governments keep their side of the bargain so that countries like Rwanda, who've increased up to over 10% and are looking for the international community to come on board, they're still waiting.
Can I come back into that question and follow on from the comment around the natural resource or biodiversity, but also the natural resource base in which the production systems obviously depend, and many of the gains have been in relation to productivity, not in relation to how we manage the resources. And I take, for example, production in India, which is and the Indo-Gangetic Plain with groundwater systems dropping rapidly, bores being sunk deeper to access water, not sustainable. So many of the gains that have been made are built on pretty fragile foundations, and those are the natural resource foundations. So the challenge not only of doubling food production in the next 40 years, replicating what's happened since the Green Revolution, but doing that in a way that not just manages the resource base better, but actually deals with many of the challenges to the resource base that have come from gains that have been achieved to date. So it's an enormously challenging task, and we've done much better in the production and productivity side than we have in the resource base side in the past. So that's where there's an enormous area for research and in relation to agriculture for gains to be made, and it's essential.
Can I try to link the private sector and the biodiversity issue and the private sector? I mean, let's not just categorise the private sector as the multinationals. Most farmers are in the private sector. Most farmers are in the private sector. Take the example of a small farmer who had the misfortune to live on the border of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Uganda. He had 1 hectare. It was a he, I'm afraid. It would work better if it was a lady, but it was a he. He had 1 hectare of land on which he grew 1,000 coffee trees. That earned him an income of about $1,000 a year. Unfortunately, the coffee wilt disease came along and killed 600 of his coffee plants. So his income fell from $1,000 down to about $300, barely enough to feed his family, certainly not enough to send them to school. A devastating coffee wilt disease, which is a fungus which got carried by coffee traffickers across the border at the time of war. The answer to that problem is multifold: better sanitation, better clearing of the fields and so on. But part of the answer lies in the biodiversity of the coffee plant itself. It was possible for researchers over a period of time to breed a coffee plant that was resistant to the fungus. So having lost everything, that farmer's property is being slowly, painfully rebuilt with a new variety of coffee. So he'll get back to his $1,000, maybe $2,000, and he'll be able to feed his family and to send them to school. So the biodiversity important there, the biodiversity there specifically of the coffee plant. He's a private farmer. He's a private sector farmer, and that's important balance to this concept of the multinationals being the big nasties.
I'd just like to open up to the audience quickly, and we'll have a chance to continue this throughout, but I'd like to bring you into the discussion. Would anyone like to ask a question?
I'm from I'm a tutor at the University of New South Wales in design, and with a particular focus on sustainability. I'm a little concerned with the emphasis on agricultural research in terms of productivity, not because it's not fundamentally vital or necessary, but because it's insufficient to the problem, which seems to be more, as has already been mentioned, a structural one, and about the composition of things like markets. I take the point that there is a different between the multinational and the small entities, but let's not deny that the multinationals have a huge influence, especially in terms of intellectual property rights and things like that. And I think of this in particular in terms of the current negotiations that are going on in terms of a Pacific Free Trade Agreement to negotiate between Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific Islands, and the concerns that they have that the liberalisation policies will, by making their labour more flexible and more fluid, that they will lose their local knowledge, that they will lose their family structures, and that they will have a flood of westernised food products such as the 2-minute noodles, the tobacco and the alcohol, which will then flow into a state situation without revenue to invest in or to generate the kind of legislation that we have. So my concern is that we need to think about this not in terms of quantitative, how much can we produce and how can we get our research to the point where we can eradicate every problem, but there's the qualitative discrepancy here that's vital to be considered.
Thank you. Archie, did you want to talk to that a bit?
Just talk a little bit to the trade situation, because I think we didn't really touch on that. I mean, Australia's positioning is actually problematic from a policy point of view. Zero tariffs, level playing fields. I mean, if someone can explain to me how we're going to establish a level playing field between French farmers and Zambian farmers, I mean, I'd really appreciate the explanation. I struggle with the concept that the Zambian farmer is going to be able to emerge without some form of protection, without some form of subsidised access to inputs such as seed and fertiliser. I think this sort of, in a sense, we're dealing with yesterday's approach to today's solution. I think the whole issue that we've got with the near collapse of the financial system globally has been based on these sorts of policies, and it's really about time that we adjusted it. I mean, this was one of Rudd's big platforms as far as the end of neoliberalism. It's about time that we started actually having responsible states coming up with solutions that meet the needs of developing countries and ending this crisis, ending climate crisis, and really getting 1 billion people up well above $2 a day.
I think if we move back into a protectionist system, we're not going back to the old story, we're going back to ancient history. I mean, if you're arguing in favour of protectionism, then I'd have to politely disagree with you. But I don't think we have the policy prescription right, and I don't think we have the right to prescribe policy. It's up to the developing countries to decide their own policy. And of course, you're right, it's not just more agricultural research or more agricultural production, it's getting that policy and institutional framework right nationally and internationally. That's vitally important. You do that by training people. You do that by enhancing their capacity to formulate their own policies which are appropriate to their circumstances. The immediate response to the world food crisis in some countries was to close their markets. to jack up import barriers, and that had the consequence of making it worse, much worse. So I hope we don't retreat into protectionist policies, but nor should we prescribe what those policies should be. It's up to the developing countries themselves to work it out for themselves. And Malawi is a case in point, where they're moving more to open and free trade. I think the successful, Ethiopia, the successful countries are those which are moving into free trade, which are opening up their trade, reducing their barriers, putting themselves under the competitive pressure, because that yields results. But I don't want to get into an argument about that issue, because I think the answer lies in allowing the developing countries to enhance their own capacity to formulate their own policies. Let's not us here sitting in Sydney say this is what they should be doing.
Can I pick up on two elements briefly in that question from Matthew, because I think it was an excellent one and covered off a range of points. One, in relation to the markets, I agree entirely. And the simple fact, today we've got 30% more food per person produced than we had in the 60s, but we've got more than 1 billion people who don't have enough to eat. So clearly markets are vital and a part of that. So the productivity story without the connection of the production to markets, it makes no sense. And the ability to generate incomes to buy food that isn't produced is important. You touched also on a nutritional aspect that we haven't dealt with that much at all in food security. And clearly food security is not just about calories, it's about the right nutrition. And so focusing on more traditional production systems and how we can make those more productive, again, and connected to markets. So if I take the example, ACIAR is investing in PNG and sweet potato work, looking at higher vitamin varieties, which fortunately are also the brighter orange varieties, so it's easier to tell which. So there's real opportunities in there as well in relation to both the productivity and nutrition. So it's not, to my mind, and the markets an either-or story. It's part of the same story. The market access aspect as well, still very key researchable areas, and we've just embarked on a new project in Botswana connecting smallholder cattle producers to markets. And again, it's to access the EU, but very tight market specifications. So how do we actually get production systems from smallholders so that they're not excluded from those markets and the price premiums that those markets bring? So the story absolutely is a very connected one. So productivity is part of it, but input chains, markets, the value chains, and the resource base on which it depends are all part of that story.
Anyone else have any questions over here?
My name's Shannon. I'm just interning at Oxfam. I was just wondering briefly, you touched on intellectual property rights and gene technologies and things like that, and I was wondering about whether this was actually cost effective for farmers in developing countries. There's been a bit of research and data that said that in the long run it's actually not, and they're paying a lot more because of the patenting of genes in these seeds and things like that. And also just whether you also touched on diversity, whether this is actually possible when we've got a scene where big multinational corporations are actually monopolising markets with their patented products and things like that.
I don't have the policy prescription for that. And this applies particularly when you start manipulating genes. And if you, one concern I do have, and it needs to be better explained to me and to the public, is the multinationals want to make a profit. You make a profit if you own the product you produce, and the way that Western societies deal with that is through intellectual property law. And if you take away that, not just from agriculture but from every other field, then you do seriously damage the economic model. What worries me a bit is that will drive research in certain directions. That'll drive research to produce products that are patentable. And that might not be the best investment of the research dollar. It might be better to invest in enhancing traditional varieties through conventional plant breeding that aren't patentable. So that's why we need to retain public investment in research to produce that sort of outcome. Don't leave it to the private sector. The short answer to the question, can the private sector do it by itself? No, it can't. But if the partnerships are right, if the incentives are right, you can get private sector investment involved, but you'll always need sustained public sector and research to put technology in the public domain.
Archie, I don't imagine too many smallhold African farmers are using patented seed or
No, I mean, there is a farmer traded seed is building, and you can get more for your seed. They know you can get more for your seed if it's clean. There's a group of women in Bangladesh, a village in Bangladesh, that worked out a way themselves to dry the seed that you use to plant the next year's crop, to dry it using a little contraption which they developed themselves. Those women, because of cultural reasons, couldn't travel to the next village to transfer that technology. So they produced a video in Bangla, which could be taken to the next village, and the next village and the next village. It took off. So they know that they can get more for their seed if it's clean, if it's not clustered with fungi, using very simple technology to dry it, and then to transfer that to using modern technology. The mobile phone these days is one product that has taken off in Africa. And can we use the mobile phone? Can we use remote microscopes to spread detection of diseases, to spread new technologies? And I think that's another one of the very positive stories that we need to get across, and we hope to do that in our forthcoming conference.
Multinationals have a huge responsibility, firstly, because of their actions. I think this is where we agree with that position. But I'd say multinationals in general, who's holding them to account for their actions? Because it sure as heck ain't the state. Multinationals actually have more power than most governments around the world, and there does need to be considered pressure. No, what we're going to do is mobilising people to take responsibility for what's theirs. When it comes to seed, I'd like to know whatever happened to the concept of the seed as part of the commons, because traditionally seed was owned by a family and then handed down to the next generation. That's traditionally how it's worked in the developing world. Now it's sort of handed over to Company X. They own it. And what happens to that sort of notion? Because really that's where we're getting at the notion of social justice and the ownership of the commons.
So if Company X invests in improving that seed, it should get no return.
I'd question on Company X, they can invest in the seed, whether or not that seed is actually used. Come back to the farmer. Let the farmer make that decision. At the moment,
They are doing that.
At the moment, the decisions are largely being made, forced onto farmers, desperate farmers, by big companies.
I don't agree with that. They're hardly involved in Africa at all. But the big success story is in India, where private sector again has been the main. We talked about extension earlier. Mm-hmm. The small to medium seed companies in India have had a big role in making seed available to farmers throughout India. It's one of the great success stories, actually, of ICRISAT, the International Crop Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, the way that they involved the small to medium market seed companies in extending their product beyond the immediate vicinity of the research centres. And that's been a fantastic success story. Now, those small to medium enterprises do it for the profit. They do it for the profit. They make profit from this, and they reinvest that profit in their marketing, in their sales, and their investment. So I think, again, we should not just blacken the private sector by using the multinational example. We should look for the positive cases if we want to persuade the Australian people and globally that there is opportunity here, that by investing in this way, private sector, small to medium size as well as large, will contribute to feeding the poor.
Any other questions? Yep, down in front.
My name's Carl Skitter. I'm with Capital C. I'm head of corporate finance and sustainability. Just a question on land title and land title legislation within these developing countries. To what extent does lack of land title systems and proper developed legislation in that area contribute to food insecurity? In that, if you have a piece of land, whilst you have all these poor people, if you actually take a step back and you look at the land that they sit on, even though each one sits on one hectare or 1 acre, it works out at billions and billions and billions of capital that's sitting there, and unless you have a proper land title system, you can't access the value by borrowing against it. So my question is, are any of you three gentlemen and your organisations doing or working in these areas to assist these countries in developing their land title legislation and systems?
We work with governments on issues of land and land titling across pretty much every country that we're working in at the moment, actually, and it's a critical issue that we haven't really addressed. land titling, land ownership, because that's part of the problem that we're seeing in the land grabbing that's going on as well. I mean, the Madagascar example is pretty well known. You want to grow food for South Korea, well, let's find a good patch of land that a government will give us. And it's always something that obviously raises anyone's radars, is when a government gives land to a company. So, well, who actually owned that land, or who had the access to the land? I'll come back to the commons. A lot of this land was commonly owned, and there's an understanding amongst the community in terms of where that land belongs. And now that has been eroded, this is where we really need to engage a lot more on issues of land titling, tightening up legislation and operationalising that legislation. It's critical.
And if I follow on from that, and ACIAR is not involved in specific work in that area with a mandate in research, it isn't a focus for us, but it's obviously critically important to the sort of investments we're making, working with producers whose title over land, or even landless producers. That's the reality of the work. So how does that constrain investment that they might make in their production systems? And if we recognise that some 85% of production is coming off land less than typically a couple of hectares, often much smaller, and the reality is that those parcels of production are decreasing in size. So we're seeing greater pressure on producing more off less land, and the consequences of that have pretty important ramifications for the sort of production systems. So we need much greater intensification, but in a sustainable way, of smaller and fragmented parcels of land. So it's the ownership question, the land title question, but also the way in which the parcels fit together to enable production of a significant enough scale.
What about the pressure of biofuels? You know, we've got climate change, peak water, peak oil, everything's competing at the moment. What about the ratio between?
It's quite a complex relationship between biofuels, food security and food prices, and I think the consensus is that the recent food price crisis was impacted by biofuel production, and estimates vary, but 30 to 50% of it may be attributable. The International Food Policy Research Institute, I think, came with a suggestion around 30% from memory. So clearly there's a link between biofuels production, and there's a link with volatility too, because historically agriculture has been linked to energy prices through inputs, so that your chemicals, your fertilisers, your input side linked to energy, but with biofuels it's the output side and the price signals, and that introduces far greater volatility into food prices.
What happened there was American maize. Okay, about 30% of American maize, I think, was the figure, was diverted to alcohol production, and a large proportion, I can't remember the proportion of sugar production in Brazil to alcohol production. That took that away. That, in the case of maize, that took that out of the international market. So we saw international market prices go up.
A big impact on food, but in terms of a percentage of the liquid energy around the globe, still only in the order of 0.2% or something like that. So it's not made a big impact on the energy side of the equation. Uncoupling food from energy is an important part of biofuels. What do technologies hold for what's termed third generation biofuels, or energy stocks that don't compete with human energy consumption? So what's typically waste streams, rice stubble, for example. So, and again, coming back to the discussions around multinationals and the role for the private sector, and companies like DuPont are investing an enormous amount in engineering technologies that can digest lignose and cellulose in a way that these waste streams can be used as energy sources that don't compete, and therefore decouple energy price, food price. So there's some real opportunities there, but currently we can see that the impacts have been more on the negative side than the positive side. In the future, potentially, income streams for smallholder producers from energy sources, but that requires some really new and innovative products to enable that to happen.
Halving poverty and hunger by 2015 is the first Millennium Development Goal. Are we going to make it by 2015? Is it likely?
It's entirely achievable. All of the MDGs are actually entirely achievable. It's purely a question of political commitment and really for governments to keep their promises. I think we're going to see that in September in New York, that the MDGs are achievable, and actually a lot more progress has been made than we'd recognise. I think part of the problem too is the MDGs are actually never intended as a country-by-country tool. It was intended as a global measurement, and the architects of the MDGs will say this as well. And so therefore it's not really capturing these huge advances that have been made. You look at halving hunger, for example. So a country like Ethiopia, if it's managed to go from 63% insecure to 46% of people insecure, it's actually missed MDG 1. And it's like, hang on, that's an amazing statistic that's coming out of Ethiopia. But it's been I think it's very clear in terms of what's required. I think this model that's been adapted in Africa, where governments are actually committing resources or engaging with their farmers, if the international community supports that at the right level, keeps its promises, I think it is achievable.
I'd agree with Archie, but I think it's important to recognise that in relation to MDG 1, halving the number of hungry people, even if we hit that target, there's still 500 million hungry people in the world. So
that's right.
it's important that we keep focused on the target, but recognise we're only there's a long way to go even when we hit the target. So certainly achievable. As I said, the renewed interest on agriculture as a result of the food price crisis is going to help us in that direction, but it needs to be for the long haul.
Yeah, I agree. We're making progress. In maternal and child health, I think we're actually ahead of the MDG, or in terms of pro rata. So in some areas we're actually achieving or ahead of achieving the Millennium Development Goals. But even in food production, where we are falling behind, there are some very good success stories. And it's a question not just for the donors, but also for the national governments in the developing countries themselves to refresh themselves, pick themselves up, brush themselves off and get back into it.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it, how stifling a goal can be if there's still all these people who fall through, or it's not quite met, but there's, it's a way to set things up. But beyond that, change with research, as you've said, can take decades, with culture and custom in Africa to ensure rights the same.
If we don't miss the goal, we shouldn't give up.
No,
if we miss the goal, we shouldn't give up, because it takes a long time.
And it's important too that people who can contribute as well. I mean, it's governments, but it's also individuals as well, giving a small percentage of your own income to support this work through organisations working on the ground. It's incredibly important. I was talking to a bunch of school kids last week, Year 5, did the usual MDG spin and our position, and a small child put up her hand and said, "Why don't the rich people give more money to stop this?" I thought, that's a fantastic question.
Simple. I'd like to, that's all the time we've got today, but I'd like to thank you all for joining us here in Sydney, and to our audience in Dili as well. And thank you very much for our panellists, and hope that you join us for our next Praxis in a month's time. Thank you.
Thanks.